So when you think about high ELO or competitive league, the champions that usually are going to come to mind are picks like Lee Sin, Azir, Kalista, Jace, Thresh, and so forth. But on the other hand, when you think of low ELO, champions like Garen, Annie, Warwick, and the like, they all stand out. Now in the past, if you ever tried to ask a good player why these simpler champions weren't picked in the higher brackets, you'd be met with a lot of dismissive responses. Maybe like, just space them, bro. They don't have CC, so they can't make any plays. They're immobile. Just gank it for free kills. That's all they were. They were noob champions to beat other low ELO players. But for the past few years, these supposedly, quote, noob champions are seeing a massive surge in play, taking over high ELO and even competitive play. Yorick, Cho'Gath, the whole Dr. Mundo craze. These basic champions are getting more and more popular every single day. But why is this? How did we go from these champions being totally useless to instead being some of the most complained about champions in high ELO? Well, that is what we're going to be breaking down in this video. A small little history lesson of how these champions became way more dominant, and also some tips for how you can abuse their strengths to help you in your climb. Now, quick side note here, we typically do not make this type of content as we focus more on the educational side of things, but if you like this type of content, do sub and let us know in the comments below. These simpler champions didn't just become OP out of nowhere, and it all partly begins with a little shift in how Riot balanced the game. In League, there used to be huge distinctions between early and scaling picks. Champions like Renekton, Rek'Sai, LeBlanc, and Kalista used to be notoriously strong in the early game, but all of them really fell off a cliff in usefulness past 20 minutes or so. Riot saw this as a glaring issue in balancing though. Early game champions are far better in the hands of good players because they can consistently get leads and are unlikely to throw those leads once they get them. On the other hand, low ELO players struggle at taking advantage of early power, so they couldn't play the champions they liked without being at a disadvantage. Now, as a result, Riot started shifting the early power of these champions in favor for more scaling in their kits. This way, less experienced players could have decent results without having to be absolutely insane on those characters. For example, Renekton used to be one of the most notorious lane bullies in the entire game that was only useful early. These days though, while he can still bully lane, he's honestly a fairly decent champion in the late game as well. Likewise, there used to be mid laners with uniquely strong early games, like Talia, Syndra, and Aurelion Sol, who could dominate the early game, but when they got reworked, they all became more traditionally scaling mages. Basically, these days, most champions are not dead weight late into the game. Now, there's obviously a difference between something like Kayle and Gnar at level 18, but every champion scales decently well these days, so the game doesn't necessarily feel awful if you don't stomp early. Well, every champion besides Pyke, which means that early game champions are not as oppressive anymore. Every top lane main can rest a bit easier knowing that Jace is not the monster that he used to be in lane anymore. Now, the end result is that you used to be required to play early game champions due to their dominance in the early game, but now you're more open to different picks. Champion viability is more about what's strong on a certain patch rather than early game champions being prioritized almost all the time. So imagine with me for a second here that you're a top lane main and you're deciding between playing Garen, one of the easiest champions in the game, or Irelia, a champion that most challengers agree takes way too much effort for how useful she really is. Let's say that if you play perfectly as Irelia, you glide through the wave, space with autos, land every spell. If you do all of that, you're 100% effective. And meanwhile, a Garen that literally presses Q, E, Ignite, and then R is 90% effective compared to Irelia. Now, obviously, these aren't exact values, but let's say that it is true. In theory, if you play Irelia perfectly, you should always be more valuable than that Garen. The problem is that it's just not possible. You will inevitably miss your skill shots. You will misclick a minion and mess up your Q reset. Irelia's effectiveness can vary drastically based on how well she plays. Meanwhile, Garen will almost always stay near 90% regardless of his mechanics. And the worst part is that on a difficult champion, not only do you have to be on point, but your kit likely has far more ways that you can be outplayed by your opponents, which means your effectiveness can be worse depending on how poorly you play and how well your enemies react. Now, as Thresh, you have to hope your enemy doesn't outplay your hook, or if you use your box, they can also just flash out of it. Thresh players alike have all experienced a fight where you feel completely worthless as a result. Comparatively, you have Nautilus with a point-and-click ultimate, who can then hook you into an easy auto-attack route. There is not a whole lot that can be messed up with this, which is precisely why simple champions have had a massive surge in popularity in the higher brackets. Everyone's going to tell you that consistency is the most important part for climbing ELO. Well, there's nothing more consistent than champions who literally cannot mess up in a fight. Now, you might think this entire video is just a rant about how easy it is to win on simpler champions. I get it if you think that. Why would you ever bother playing something that takes skill when you can roll your face across the keyboard and literally win as Warwick, right? Well, if that was the case, then more complex champions would not be played nearly as much as they still are. That's because high-skilled champions still have a huge advantage over simple characters, and it all comes down to their versatility. They usually come with some mobility in their kits, which often allows more difficult champions to come out ahead in a wide variety of situations if they play properly. They can engage those riskier fights, or they can go for kills you otherwise wouldn't expect them to. Simple champions, on the other hand, they have a huge trade-off for being so consistent in fights. They're usually extremely linear in how they play. For example, all Annie will ever do is run at you in a straight line and press tibbers to try and burst. She's pretty dang good at doing that, but that's really it. Sometimes she may use flash, but that's about as versatile as her kit literally gets. This is why simpler champions are actually harder than everyone thinks they are. The skill in playing them properly doesn't necessarily come from the mechanics required for winning fights with them. It comes from the fact that they have very, very clear strengths and very clear weaknesses. Due to Mundo's popularity, he's by far the easiest champion to highlight this on. Mundo sucks. He's terrible in the early game. He also doesn't have a lot of playmaking potential and is extremely predictable in what he's going to do. His literal strength is that he made up for all those weaknesses by becoming an unkillable tank that one-shots squishies though. Now in theory, good players should be able to shut down Mundo's early game, but good players have also gotten much better at resisting being shut down. This is the key to making simple champions seem completely broken in high elo. Challengers and pros have become way more disciplined in how they play and are minimizing the weaknesses of their champions through fundamentals to take advantage of their consistency. Mundo's early game is weak? No problem, they say. You can survive almost any matchup with good fundamentals, like managing the first few waves properly, knowing your wave clear breakpoints to push waves fast, turning bounce backs into guaranteed crashes to set up base timers. Or better yet, on top of all that, you know honey fruits spawn at 6.5 minutes, so you trade all your HP on that timer to have priority for the free heal. How about Annie? Well, she has terrible range in lane, letting her be poked down in most matchups. And her wave clear, absolutely atrocious. So how did pros adapt to that? Well, they throw tibbers down just to take control over the lane, even if it'll never score a kill. Also, Annie prefers max and Q, but pros compromise and max W so they can actually shove out waves. With these two adaptations, pros are far better at surviving Annie's weak points in lane, so they can take advantage of how OP she is in setting up her team with reliable engages. Simply put, your goal in easy champions is to use your game knowledge to get past the moments where you're weak so you can abuse their lane consistency in fights. So how each and every champion accomplishes this task can vary quite a bit though. For some, you just need good general fundamentals to get through the parts of the game where you're weak. On others, like Annie, you really need specific information, like how to use your ultimate or switching up your skill order. Now, a little bit of a humble brag here, but at Skill Capped, we make sure you have all the information you need no matter what champion that you're trying to learn. We provide up-to-date educational commentaries for every single champion so you know exactly how to adapt to get the most out of your unique picks. For example, Strompist, one of the best Rise players in the world who knows every little detail about the champion.
Nice, very nice. Oh, the very, very nice thing about this Rise buff is the fact that my EQ would normally do about like 98 damage. So I'm doing quite the increased amount of damage. So when you get a solo kill, you can just instantly clear the wave.
It's those little things like knowing exactly how much damage his spells do at every stage of the game, or how he shares his completely unique build on Rise, giving him absurd damage, allowing him to stomp most games. Our educational commentaries provide the specific champion knowledge that you need to climb, and our premium fundamental courses teach you everything from the draft phase all the way to the late game team fights. This way, you'll have everything you need to climb ELO fast, and it's all backed by our 5-division rank up guarantee while actively using our courses. Don't climb, get your money back, and it is literally as simple as that. Use the discount link below to sign up, but back to our video here. What Challenger players have realized through all of this is that there's 3 key concepts that take basic champions from simple noob stompers to legitimate threats in high elo. The first is almost every single one of these champions share a similar issue: unreliable engage. If you're playing a basic character, it usually means that your ability to start fights is pretty low. Without mobility, it's hard to catch the other champions who can just run away from you. Think champions like Yorick, Garen, Volibear, Mordekaiser, Malzahar, and so on. All of these champions, it's almost impossible to catch someone who doesn't want to fight you. You really need to avoid getting swept up in the randomness of solo queue when piloting these types of picks. Instead, one of your most consistent strategies for scoring kills is by forcing your opponents to fight you. Summoner's Rift is rich with resources to contest. If you push a wave to an enemy tower, your opponent has to come contest you. This way, you don't need engage to force a fight. They'll need to stop your push, or they're going to lose their tower. This is how a champion like Trundle can find 1v1 duels consistently. Or you could look to invade the enemy jungle. Ryze usually struggles to get in range to fight enemies, but Ryze has such strong wave clear that he can threaten to take enemy jungle camps all the time. And your opponents, they're not going to like that. So they'll be forced to fight you to prevent the invade, which allows you to bypass your lack of engage options. This is one of the first big details you want to solve on your specific champion. If you lack engage, then always think how you can force your enemies to walk into you. And if you got no ideas after listening to that, then being at objectives is always going to be a good option for that, obviously, since your opponents will want to contest you. So up next at number 2 is playing around your cooldowns way more deliberately. Your flash in particular is definitely a big one here. Think of champions like Maokai, Twisted Fate, Darius, or Malzahar. They don't all have terrible engage, but their surprise engages are insanely strong and almost impossible to react to whenever you have your flash up. And without flash, well, you're a bit predictable in what you're trying to do. Simple champions, they live and die by their cooldowns a little bit more than their complex counterparts. For example, Twisted Fate's general game plan revolves around finding engages on his flash and ultimate timers. TF is very good at doing so, but without these spells, literally everyone could just walk away from him. So your goal here is typically going to be to reduce variance and try to slow the game down when your cooldowns aren't up on these types of characters. TF players tend to spam shove waves in between their cooldowns coming back up to give their opponents no time to do anything. Meanwhile, Twisted Fate's just biding his time here, waiting for one of his high cooldown engage tools to come back up. And one final reason why you want to be way more disciplined about playing with your flash up as a simple champion is because more difficult champions do tend to rely on landing a key ability to take you down. So let's say you're fighting a tricky champion like Zed as a Smolder. Your goal is to time your flash for his Qs to avoid a huge part of that damage. Now on the other hand, Smolder is just relying on his point and click spells for the most part, so there's not much Zed can really outplay there. This is what good players have become so much better at doing. They know what cooldowns make them strong, and they try to slow down the game when those spells aren't up. Likewise, they know what cooldowns make their opponents feel useless, and only engage them when those spells are up as well. And finally, one of the most important concepts of all is item spikes. Usually, simpler champions tend to have an item in their build that interacts with their kit in some way, which makes them way stronger or mitigates one of their inherent weaknesses. Now, of course, buying a completed item on any champion is always going to be a big spike, but on basic champions, the spike you're worrying about aren't just to get raw stats to deal more damage. It's going to be those item completions which provide that extra bit of utility your character is probably lacking. For example, there is a colossal difference between a Garen with Deadman's Plate and without Deadman's Plate. His threat level goes through the roof because movement speed fixes the biggest issue Garen has, just catching someone. Or the most popular example out of all of them, Mundo. At the start of the game, he is just a punching bag who has to deal with getting harassed constantly. But once he has Warmogs, he can just shrug off all the harass that comes his way, allowing him to push with no regards to any consequences. Basically, you need to learn to slow the game down and to patiently wait for those critical item breakpoints more so than other characters have to do. Because if you hit your spike while you're even in the game with your opponents, then usually these simple champions, they start doing really disgustingly OP things with their kits. And there is nothing your opponents can do about this because everything your champion does is point and click, guaranteed to work. Now, obviously, in one singular short video, we could not even begin to fully explain how to take full advantage of all these champions. But hopefully, this video did give you an idea as to why there's been such a huge surge in power in higher brackets compared to before, and also the skills you need to work on to make these champions feel as OP as everyone in high elo claims them to be. Now, if you do want to learn those skills reliably, then make sure to sign up at SkillCapped with the discount link below. And as always, thank you all for watching, and we'll see you soon.